Now, we are going to look into layout managers that are available in Java. The layout manager determines how the GUI components are added to the container, such as the content pane of a frame. Layout managers are set in containers using the setLayout layout manager method in a container. Examples of basic layout manager are FlowLayout, BorderLayout, and also GridLayout. FlowLayout. In using this layout, GUI components are placed in left to right order. When a component does not fit on the same line, left to right placement continues on the next line. As a default, components on each line are centered. When the frame containing the component is resized, the placement of components is adjusted accordingly. FlowLayout example. In this slide, it shows the placement of 5 buttons by using FlowLayout. Center alignment is used as a default. It can be set to a different alignment at the time a FlowLayout is created. We are going to look into the code of it in the next few slides. In the second screenshot below, the button's placement is adjusted accordingly when the frame's width is widened or shortened. The components are arranged in the container from left to right in the order in which they were added. When one row becomes filled, a new row is started. FlowLayout can be aligned in 3 ways: FlowLayout.left, which is left aligned, FlowLayout.right, which is right aligned, and FlowLayout.center, which is center aligned. By default, the components on each line are centered, so you don't have to specifically write FlowLayout.center. In the screenshot over here, it shows that the components are being left aligned. That means that FlowLayout.left was used. FlowLayout Constructors. If you look at the Java API for FlowLayout, you will see that FlowLayout has 3 constructors. So the first one, we have FlowLayout int align, int hgap, and also int vgap. What it means is it will construct a new flowchart with a specified alignment, horizontal gap, and vertical gap. The gaps are the distances in pixels between the components. The second constructor is public FlowLayout int alignment. It constructs a new FlowLayout with a specified alignment and a default gap of 5 pixels for both horizontal and vertical. If you have a specific horizontal gap and vertical gap that you want to have, you would use the first constructor. The third constructor is public FlowLayout. It constructs a new FlowLayout with a default center alignment and a default gap of 5 pixels for both horizontal and vertical. Let's look at this code. So over here, we are setting the FlowLayout to be aligned left, and then we have our horizontal gap 20 pixel and vertical gap 10 pixel. So the way to write it, we have our container called cpane. So we would write cpane.setLayout new FlowLayout, and then the alignment FlowLayout.left, comma, the horizontal gap 20, and then the vertical gap 10. When we create our buttons and add those to our container, it will be arranged according to our layout, which is the flow layout, and it would be aligned to the left side. The buttons would have a horizontal gap of 20 and vertical gap of 10. On your online learning, I have shared this code in a file called GUI3.java. In this code, 10 buttons are created. In the FlowLayout method, I have used all 3 constructors. There are 3 constructors being used over here. If you want to see the output of each of them, comment out the one that you don't want to see. If you want to see the first constructor, which is new flow layout that does not take any input, then you need to comment out the second and the third line of it. If you run the first constructor, everything will be aligned at center, and the H gap and V gap would be set to 5 pixels. If you use the second constructor, which is FlowLayout.Right, where you set the alignment to the right side, then you will get the middle screenshot. In this one, the horizontal and vertical gaps are set to 5 pixels. In the last constructor, where you define the alignment, the horizontal gap and also the vertical gap, if you run it, you will get the third screenshot. For example, the one that I have written in the code is FlowLayout.Center, horizontal gap of 10 and vertical gap of 35 pixels. What happens if I try to resize the window? The components, or in this case the buttons, are placed on the same line and continues on the next line. Border layout. This layout manager divides the container into 5 regions: center, north, south, east, and west. The north and south regions expand or shrink in width only. The east and west regions expand or shrink in height only. The center region expands or shrinks on both height and width. Not all regions have to be occupied. If you look at the BorderLayout API, there are 2 constructors. The first one is BorderLayout, where it constructs a new border layout with no gaps between the components. And there's also BorderLayout horizontal gap and also vertical gap, where it constructs a border layout with the specified gaps between the components. Border layout can assign components into 5 regions. So we have BorderLayout.North, BorderLayout.South, BorderLayout.Center, BorderLayout.East, and also BorderLayout.West. This slide shows an example of using border layout. For example, we are adding our button, which we call button 1 at BorderLayout.North. And then we have another button called button 2, and we add that button at BorderLayout.South. So it will place those buttons accordingly. Say that we have button 4 at BorderLayout.West, button 5 at BorderLayout.Center, and button 3 at BorderLayout.East. It will be arranged as what we have specified. If we try to resize the frame, the north and south regions, which is button 1 and button 2, will expand or shrink in width only. Button 4 and button 3, which is the west and east regions, they will expand or shrink in height only. Button 5, which is the center region, it expands and shrinks on both height and width. Keep in mind that if you are using border layout, not all regions have to be occupied. Let's look at this example. So this code is available on your online learning. So the file is GUI3.java. So over here, the first one, I use the first constructor, which takes in no input. And then I have 5 buttons, and I add each of them to north, south, west, east, and center. So the right hand side is the screenshot of what should appear. The second one, I use the constructor where I have written my horizontal gap and also my vertical gap to 50. In the screenshot, you can see that there are gaps between the buttons. Using the same example as before, say that right now I'm using the constructor, which is the no argument constructor for border layout. I have 4 buttons and I have my button 0 at north, button 1 at south, button 2 at west, and also button 3 at east. I did not set any buttons for the center part. So if I run this code, it will show me the screenshot where my middle part, which is the center, is being left blank. This is to show you that in border layout, not all regions have to be occupied. In grid layout, this layout manager places GUI components on equal size n by m grids. Components are placed in top to bottom, left to right order. The number of rows and columns remains the same after the frame is resized, but the width and height of each region will change. If we look at the Java API, in GridLayout, there are 3 constructors. The first one, which is GridLayout, it creates a grid layout with a default of 1 column per component in a single row. The second constructor, GridLayout int rows, int columns, it creates a grid layout with the specified number of rows and columns. The third one is GridLayout int rows, int columns, int horizontal gap, int vertical gap. It creates a grid layout with the specified number of rows and columns and also the horizontal and vertical gap between the components. Here is showing an example of grid layout. Say that we have 5 buttons, so it will be arranged from top to bottom, left to right. When we resize the frame, the number of rows and columns will still remain the same, but the width and the height of the buttons will change. Using the code from GUI3.java, if we use the first constructor, which is grid layout that takes no argument, it will show the first screenshot where all the buttons are being arranged in one row. Say that we use the other constructor where we write grid layout 3 rows 4 columns, then we will get the middle screenshot where we now have 3 rows and 4 columns. If we specify the horizontal and vertical gap, we will get the third screenshot where we have 3 rows, 4 columns, the H gap is 10 and the V gap is 30 pixels. If we try to resize it, the number of rows and columns will still be the same, only the width and the height will be changed. Try out this code and change the numbers to see what would be the effect of it on the buttons or any other components. When you run this code, make sure that you comment out the lines that you don't want to see. For example, in this one, we have 3 constructors. If you run this code, it will read the last constructor, which is new grid layout, 3 rows, 4 columns, horizontal gap 10 and vertical gap 30.